the woman who never told her secret. The sun had not yet risen when Hannah Brooks stepped out onto her farm. The morning air was cool, and a thin layer of fog covered the endless fields of corn. Birds chirped softly as the first light painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. For most people, it was just another peaceful morning. For Hannah, it was another day of carrying a secret that had lived inside her heart for nearly 20 years. Every morning began the same way. She fed the chickens. She checked the horses. She walked through every field, making sure the crops were healthy. By the time the rest of the town was awake, Hannah had already finished hours of work. Everyone knew her as the strongest woman in Millbrook. She never complained. She never asked anyone for help. And she never spoke about her past. The people in town respected her. Some admired her. Others feared the mystery surrounding her life. Many wondered why a beautiful, hardworking woman had chosen to live alone for so many years. Whenever someone asked about her family, she simply smiled and changed the subject. No one knew the truth, not even her closest friends. Inside the old farmhouse, an antique wooden box sat hidden beneath her bed. Every night before sleeping, Hannah opened the box. Inside was an old photograph, a faded wedding ring, and a sealed letter tied with a blue ribbon. She looked at them silently. Then she carefully closed the box again. She had made herself one promise years ago. No matter what happens, this secret must stay buried. One afternoon, Hannah visited the local farmer's market to sell fresh vegetables and homemade honey. Children waved as she passed. Older farmers greeted her with warm smiles. "Morning, Hannah. Your tomatoes are the best in the county." She thanked everyone politely. But something felt different that day. Across the street, a black luxury SUV slowly pulled into town. Almost nobody in Millbrook drove expensive vehicles. People stopped what they were doing and looked toward the stranger. A tall man stepped out. He wore an expensive suit, dark sunglasses, and carried a leather briefcase. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a farming town. His eyes searched the market until they stopped on Hannah. For several seconds, he simply stared at her. Then he quietly whispered, "So, she's still alive." Hannah didn't notice him. She continued serving customers with her usual smile. The stranger asked an elderly shopkeeper, "Is that Hannah Brooks?" The old man nodded. "She's lived here for almost 20 years. The stranger looked surprised. "Has she ever left town?" "Not that anyone remembers." He thanked the shopkeeper and walked away. From a distance, he continued watching Hannah. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't friendly either. It was the expression of someone who had spent years searching for one person. That evening, Hannah returned home just before sunset. As always, she walked into her bedroom and opened the old wooden box. She gently picked up the sealed letter. Her hands trembled. For years, she had wanted to open it, but fear always stopped her. She placed the letter back inside. Then she whispered softly, "Not yet!" Outside the farmhouse, a car engine slowly came to a stop. The same black SUV was parked across the road. The stranger looked toward Hannah's house. He removed an old photograph from his wallet. The woman in the picture was much younger, but there was no doubt. It was Hannah. He folded the photograph carefully. Then he said words that would change everything. "I finally found you." Inside the farmhouse, Hannah stood by the window, unaware that someone from her forgotten past had just arrived. The secret she had protected for 20 years was about to come back and change her life forever. The letter hidden for 20 years. Hannah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she remembered the black SUV parked across the road. She had lived in Millbrook for nearly 20 years. Strangers almost never came to town, and something about that man felt familiar. The next morning, she woke before sunrise as always. She tried to focus on her work. She fed the animals. She watered the crops. She repaired a broken fence. But her mind kept returning to one question. Who was he? As the morning passed, the stranger finally appeared. He walked slowly toward the farmhouse. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He simply looked determined. Hannah watched him from the porch. When he reached the front gate, he stopped. "Are you Hannah Brooks?" he asked politely. She looked at him carefully. "Yes. My name is Ethan Walker." There was a long silence. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Ethan continued, "but I've been looking for you for a very long time." Hannah's heart began to race. "I think you've made a mistake." Ethan slowly reached into his briefcase. I'm afraid I haven't. He pulled out an old photograph. It showed a young Hannah standing beside a smiling man in front of a farmhouse. Hannah's face turned pale. She hadn't seen that photograph in over 20 years. Where did you get that? She whispered. Ethan looked directly into her eyes. It belonged to my father. The world seemed to stop. Hannah took one step backward. She could barely breathe. My father spent the last 15 years searching for you, Ethan said. He passed away 6 months ago. Before he died, he asked me to find the woman in this photograph. Hannah felt tears forming in her eyes. She wanted to ask 100 questions. Instead, she asked only one. What was your father's name? Ethan answered quietly. Michael Walker. The moment she heard the name, the color disappeared from her face. She closed her eyes. Memories she had buried for 2 decades came rushing back. A rainy night, a burning farmhouse, a promise, a goodbye she had never expected. Without another word, Hannah turned around and walked into the house. Ethan remained outside, unsure whether to leave or wait. Several minutes passed. Finally, Hannah returned. In her hands was the old wooden box. She placed it carefully on the porch table. For years, no one had ever seen what was inside. She slowly opened the lid. Ethan looked inside. There was an old wedding ring, several faded photographs, and a sealed envelope tied with a blue ribbon. This letter, Hannah whispered, was written by your father. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. My father? She nodded. He gave it to me the night before he disappeared. Ethan could hardly speak. Then why didn't you ever open it? Hannah looked down at the envelope. Because I promised him I wouldn't. There was another long silence. Finally, Ethan asked, what if that letter contains the answers both of us have been searching for? Hannah gently picked up the envelope. For 20 years, fear had kept it closed. But now, the past had found its way back to her doorstep. Her hands trembled as she slowly untied the blue ribbon. She looked at Ethan. Then she looked at the letter. After 20 years, she was finally ready to discover the truth. As she carefully broke the old seal, a folded piece of paper slipped onto the floor. It wasn't a letter. It was a map, and written across the top were 7 words that changed everything. The truth was never buried on this farm. Hannah and Ethan looked at each other in complete silence. Neither of them realized they had just uncovered the first clue in a mystery that had been hidden for 20 years. The map that changed everything. For several seconds, neither Hannah nor Ethan said a single word. The old map lay on the wooden table between them. Its edges were worn and yellow with age. Across the top, written in Michael Walker's handwriting, were the chilling words. The truth was never buried on this farm. Ethan carefully unfolded the map. It showed the surrounding countryside exactly as it had looked 20 years earlier. Most of the landmarks had changed. Old roads had disappeared. New buildings had been constructed. But one location had been circled with red ink. An abandoned windmill nearly 5 miles from Hannah's farm. What is this place? Ethan asked. Hannah stared at the map. I haven't been there in almost 20 years. Why? A shadow crossed her face. Because that's where everything fell apart. The room became silent. Outside, the wind gently moved through the cornfields. Hannah finally took a deep breath. I've hidden the truth for too long. She looked directly at Ethan. Your father and I weren't just friends. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Hannah picked up the old wedding ring from the wooden box. Tears filled her eyes. We were husband and wife. Ethan froze. My father was your husband? Hannah nodded slowly. We were married in secret. Why would you keep that hidden? Because someone wanted us separated. She walked to the window and looked toward the distant hills. 20 years ago, your grandfather owned most of the land around Millbrook. He cared more about money than family. When he discovered Michael had secretly married a poor farm girl, he threatened to destroy both of us. Ethan struggled to process everything he was hearing. My father never told me any of this. He couldn't. Just days after our wedding, he disappeared. Everyone believed Michael had abandoned Hannah. The town whispered behind her back. Some called her foolish. Others believed she had invented the marriage. Eventually, Hannah stopped trying to explain. She buried her pain and built a new life alone. But I never believed he left willingly, she whispered. Ethan looked at the map again. So you think this map explains what really happened? Before Hannah could answer, someone knocked loudly on the front door. Both of them jumped. Hannah slowly opened it. Standing outside was Sheriff Daniel Ross. He removed his hat politely. "I'm sorry to disturb you." Hannah smiled nervously. "What brings you here?" The sheriff glanced toward Ethan. "I received a report that strangers have been asking questions around town." Ethan introduced himself. Daniel listened carefully. Then his expression changed. "You said your name is Ethan Walker?" "Yes." The sheriff remained silent for a moment. "My father was sheriff here 20 years ago. He left behind an unfinished investigation." Hannah's heart began racing. "What investigation?" Daniel looked directly at both of them. "The disappearance of Michael Walker." Neither Hannah nor Ethan spoke. Daniel slowly reached into his jacket. He removed an old leather notebook. "It belonged to my father. I found it after he passed away." He opened the notebook to the final page. There was only one sentence written there. Michael Walker did not run away. Below it, another sentence. Someone powerful made him disappear. The room fell completely silent. For 20 years, everyone had believed Michael had abandoned Hannah. But now, the sheriff's notebook suggested something much darker. Daniel carefully closed the notebook. "I think it's time we reopen this case." At that exact moment, none of them noticed a black pickup truck parked on a hill overlooking Hannah's farm. Inside the truck, an older man watched the farmhouse through binoculars. He lowered them slowly. Then he made a phone call. They found the map. A voice on the other end asked, "What do we do now?" The man answered coldly, "Make sure they never find what's waiting at the windmill." The call ended. The truck quietly drove away. Meanwhile, inside the farmhouse, Hannah, Ethan, and Sheriff Daniel spread the old map across the table once again. Tomorrow morning, they would travel to the abandoned windmill. None of them knew that someone else would be waiting for them. The truth beneath the windmill. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Hannah, Ethan, and Sheriff Daniel left for the abandoned windmill. The road was rough and covered with weeds. Hardly anyone had traveled this path in years. As they drove deeper into the countryside, Hannah became unusually quiet. "This road hasn't changed," she whispered. "I used to come here with Michael." Ethan looked at her. "What was he like?" A small smile appeared on Hannah's face. He believed every problem could be solved with kindness. He loved this land more than anything, and he dreamed of building a future where no family would ever lose their farm. A few minutes later, the old windmill came into view. It stood alone in the middle of an empty field. Its broken blades creaked softly in the wind. Nature had almost swallowed the building. Daniel stepped out first. "Stay close." The three of them slowly walked inside. Dust covered the wooden floor. Broken farming tools lay scattered everywhere. For years, this place had remained untouched. Ethan unfolded the old map. The red circle pointed toward the center of the windmill. "There," he said. They moved aside an old wooden table that had collapsed years ago. Underneath it, they discovered a rusted metal hatch hidden beneath layers of dirt. Daniel pulled hard on the handle. It wouldn't move. Together, the three of them finally forced it open. A cold draft of air escaped from below. A narrow staircase disappeared into darkness. Daniel switched on his flashlight. "Let's go." Step by step, they descended into the underground room. The air smelled old and damp. Cobwebs covered the stone walls. At the far end of the room stood a large wooden chest. Its lock had already rusted away. Hannah's hands trembled as she slowly lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of documents wrapped in oilcloth, bundles of old letters, property records, bank papers, and one small leather journal. Ethan carefully opened the journal. The first page read, "If you're reading this, I failed to protect my family." He immediately recognized the handwriting. "It belongs to my father." As Ethan continued reading, the room fell silent. Michael had written about secret meetings with powerful landowners. He described how they forced struggling farmers to sell their land for almost nothing. Anyone who refused was threatened. Some disappeared from the town completely. Others lost everything they owned. Then came the final pages. Michael had discovered the entire scheme. He planned to expose everyone involved. But before he could reveal the truth, he realized his own life was in danger. The last sentence made Hannah's heart stop. "If anything happens to me, never trust Richard Walker." Ethan looked up in shock. "Richard Walker?" My grandfather. Daniel closed the journal slowly. It wasn't strangers who betrayed Michael. It was someone inside his own family. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed above them. The hatch slammed shut. Darkness surrounded the room. Someone had locked them inside. Daniel ran toward the stairs and pushed against the heavy hatch. It wouldn't move. From above, footsteps slowly crossed the wooden floor. Then a deep voice called down, "You should have left the past alone." Hannah immediately recognized the voice. She hadn't heard it in 20 years, but she could never forget it. Richard Walker, the man who had destroyed her life, the man everyone believed had retired years ago. He was alive, and he had been watching them all along. A cold silence filled the underground chamber. Hannah looked at Ethan. Then she whispered, "The real battle is only beginning." The man behind the lies. The heavy hatch slammed shut above them. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The underground chamber fell into complete darkness except for the beam of Sheriff Daniel's flashlight. Daniel rushed to the staircase and pushed against the metal hatch with all his strength. It didn't move. "It's locked from the outside," he said. Ethan looked up in frustration. "There has to be another way out." Hannah remained surprisingly calm. She slowly closed Michael's journal and held it tightly against her chest. "I knew this day would come," she whispered. Daniel turned toward her. "You expected Richard to return?" Hannah nodded. "Not today, but someday." She looked around the underground room. Michael always planned ahead. If he hid these documents here, he probably prepared an escape route too. The three of them searched every corner of the cellar. Old farming tools, broken barrels, stone walls covered in dust. Nothing. Then Ethan noticed something unusual. One wall sounded hollow when he knocked on it. "Daniel, listen." Daniel tapped the wall with the handle of his flashlight. He heard it too. Together, they pushed against the loose stones. After several minutes, one of the stones shifted. A narrow tunnel appeared behind it. Fresh air drifted inside. Hannah smiled for the first time that day. "I knew Michael wouldn't trap us." One by one, they crawled through the tunnel. It was long, dark, and barely wide enough to fit through. Nearly 20 minutes later, they emerged behind a cluster of trees, nearly half a mile from the windmill. Daniel looked back toward the hill. "We're free." But Hannah wasn't smiling anymore. She stared toward the windmill. Richard's black SUV was driving away. "He knows we found the journal," she said quietly. "And now he knows we're still alive." Back at the farmhouse, Daniel carefully read every page of Michael's journal. One entry caught his attention. It mentioned a bank's safety deposit box that had never been opened. Written beside it was a number. Box 217. Daniel looked at Hannah. "Did Michael ever tell you about this?" She shook her head. "No. If this box still exists, it could contain the evidence he couldn't hide at the windmill." The next morning, they traveled to the old county bank. The manager searched through decades-old records. After several minutes, he looked surprised. "The safety deposit box is still active, but it has never been opened." Hannah's heart pounded. The manager unlocked the small metal box and placed it on the table. Inside were several sealed envelopes, a flash drive, and one final letter addressed in Michael's handwriting. "To Hannah, if you ever find this." Tears filled Hannah's eyes. She carefully opened the letter. "My dearest Hannah, if you are reading this, it means I never made it home. I did not leave you by choice. Richard discovered everything. He wanted our land, our future, and every farm surrounding Millbrook. When I refused to help him, he threatened the people I loved most. I had only one chance to protect you. I disappeared so you could live, but I never stopped loving you. One day, the truth will find its way back to you. When it does, don't seek revenge. Seek justice. The evidence you need is on the flash drive. Love forever. Michael." Hannah could no longer hold back her tears. For 20 long years, she had believed Michael might have abandoned her. Now she finally knew the truth. He had sacrificed everything to save her life. Daniel carefully picked up the flash drive. "If what's on here matches the journal, we finally have the proof." Just then, the bank manager hurried back into the room. "You need to leave." Daniel frowned. "Why?" The manager looked frightened. "There are 3 black SUVs pulling into the parking lot." Hannah looked through the window. Men in dark suits were stepping out. One of them pointed directly toward the bank entrance. Richard Walker had found them again. And this time, He wasn't planning to let them escape. The flash drive, the 3 black SUVs came to a stop outside the county bank. Men in dark suits stepped out one by one. None of them wore uniforms. None of them showed any identification. But the way they moved together made one thing clear. They had come for only one reason. The flash drive. Inside the bank, Hannah looked at Daniel. "What do we do?" Daniel remained calm. "There are 2 exits." He quickly turned to the bank manager. "Is the rear entrance still open?" The manager nodded nervously. "Yes, but it leads to the old parking lot." "That's good enough." Without wasting another second, the 4 of them hurried through a narrow hallway toward the back door. Just as they reached it, the sound of the front door echoed through the building. Someone had entered the bank. A deep voice called out, "Nobody leaves." Hannah felt her heart pounding. Daniel quietly opened the rear door. "Go!" They ran into the empty parking lot. Rain had started falling. Within seconds, they reached Daniel's truck. The engine roared to life. As they pulled onto the road, one of the black SUVs spotted them. "There they are!" The SUVs followed. For several tense minutes, they stayed behind Daniel's truck, but he kept a steady pace and avoided taking unnecessary risks. Eventually, Daniel turned onto a narrow country road that wound through the hills. The larger vehicles slowed down. By the time they reached the next intersection, the SUVs were gone. Ethan looked back through the rear window. "I think we lost them." Daniel didn't smile. "Only for now." That evening, they returned to Hannah's farmhouse. Daniel placed the flash drive on the kitchen table. This could answer every question. Ethan connected it to his laptop. The screen lit up. There were dozens of folders, photographs, scanned contracts, audio recordings, financial records. Every file had been carefully organized by Michael. "He planned this," Ethan whispered. "He knew someone might find it one day." Daniel opened the first recording. Michael's voice filled the room. "If you're listening to this, I may already be gone. Richard Walker isn't acting alone." Several powerful businessmen joined him. They forced struggling farmers to sell their land through threats, lies, and fake debts. I copied every record I could find. If these files ever become public, the truth will finally be impossible to hide. The recording ended. No one spoke. The silence fell heavy. Hannah wiped away a tear. For 20 years, he carried this burden alone. Daniel continued opening the files. One contract after another revealed the same pattern. Families had been pressured. Signatures had been manipulated. Land had quietly changed hands. Every document pointed toward Richard Walker. But then, Ethan opened the final folder. Its name was simple. "If Richard finds this." Inside was a short video recorded by Michael only days before he disappeared. Michael looked directly into the camera. "If anything happens to me, Richard will claim that I abandoned my family. That is a lie. I leave this message of my own free will. I have given copies of these records to one person I trust. If this flash drive is ever found, find Grace Miller. She knows where the final evidence is hidden." The video ended. Daniel looked confused. "Who's Grace Miller?" Hannah's eyes widened. "I haven't heard that name in 20 years. Ethan leaned forward. "You know her?" Hannah nodded slowly. "Grace was my closest friend. She helped Michael and me the night we got married." Daniel asked quietly, "Where is she now?" Hannah looked toward the old family photo hanging on the wall. "I don't know. The last I heard, she left Millbrook without telling anyone." At that exact moment, a phone on the kitchen table began to ring. No caller ID. Daniel answered carefully. No one spoke for several seconds. Then an elderly woman's voice whispered, "Hannah, if you found Michael's message, don't trust anyone. I'm coming home." The call ended immediately. Hannah stared at the silent phone. Only one person had ever called her by that tone. Grace Miller. After 20 years, the only witness who knew the complete truth was finally returning to Millbrook. The woman who knew the truth. The next morning, a cold mist covered the roads leading into Millbrook. Hannah stood on the front porch, unable to take her eyes off the empty highway. 20 years. It had been 20 years since she had last seen Grace Miller. She wondered if she would even recognize her. Around 9 o'clock, an old blue pickup truck slowly pulled into the driveway. The engine stopped. The driver's door opened. An elderly woman stepped out, carrying a small brown suitcase. Her hair had turned gray. Time had left lines on her face. But the moment Hannah saw her eyes, she knew. Grace. The two women ran toward each other and embraced tightly. Neither of them could hold back their tears. "I thought I'd never see you again," Hannah whispered. Grace smiled sadly. "I promised Michael I would come back, when it was finally safe." Inside the farmhouse, Ethan and Sheriff Daniel listened quietly. Grace placed the old suitcase on the kitchen table. "I've carried this for 20 years, she said. "No one, not even my own family, knew what was inside." She unlocked the suitcase. Inside were dozens of old documents, photographs, and a small cassette recorder. Daniel looked surprised. "You kept all of this?" Grace nodded. "The night Michael disappeared, he came to my house. He looked terrified. He said, 'If anything happens to me, don't tell anyone the truth until Hannah is safe.'" Hannah wiped away another tear. "He was protecting me." Grace nodded. "Yes. He knew Richard would stop at nothing." Ethan carefully picked up one of the photographs. It showed Michael standing beside several wealthy businessmen. One face immediately caught his attention. He froze. "That's impossible." Daniel looked at the picture. "What is it?" Ethan pointed at one man standing next to Richard Walker. "I know him. That's Senator Charles Bennett." Daniel frowned. "The same senator who still represents this county?" Ethan nodded slowly. Grace took a deep breath. Richard wasn't acting alone. He had powerful friends. They helped him pressure farmers into selling their land. They protected each other for years. The room fell silent. The truth was far bigger than anyone had imagined. Just then, Grace picked up the old cassette recorder. "I've never played this recording. Michael told me to save it until the right time." Daniel carefully inserted fresh batteries. With a click, the tape began to play. Michael's voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this recording, then the people responsible are still trying to hide the truth. Richard Walker didn't only steal land. He created fake debts, bribed officials, and threatened honest families. But there is one document they fear more than anything else. The original ownership agreement. It proves every illegal transfer began with one forged signature. Grace knows where it is. Protect Hannah. Protect the truth." The recording ended. Nobody spoke. Grace slowly reached into her suitcase. She removed a long, sealed envelope. "I've protected this for 20 years. She handed it to Daniel. Inside was the original land ownership agreement. The signature had clearly been altered. Daniel examined it carefully. "This changes everything." Before anyone could speak again, a loud explosion echoed outside. The farmhouse windows shook. Everyone rushed to the front porch. One of Hannah's equipment sheds was on fire. Dark smoke rose into the sky. A nearby worker shouted. Someone threw something into the shed and drove away. Daniel immediately called the fire department. Neighbors rushed in with hoses and buckets. Together, they managed to stop the fire before it spread to the farmhouse. Hannah looked across the fields. In the distance, a black SUV disappeared over the hill. Richard Walker had sent one final warning. Grace placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder. "He knows we found the evidence." Daniel looked at the burned shed. "No." He held up the sealed document. "He knows he's running out of time." For the first time in 20 years, every piece of the puzzle had finally come together. Now, only one battle remained. To bring the truth into the light, and make sure justice could never be buried again. The day the truth was revealed, the fire was finally out. Smoke still drifted through the air as firefighters packed up their equipment. Hannah stood silently, looking at what remained of her storage shed. The building had been damaged. Several farming tools had been destroyed, but the most important thing had survived. The evidence. Richard Walker had failed. Sheriff Daniel carefully placed the original land agreement, Michael's journal, the flash drive, and Grace's documents into a secure evidence case. "This leaves my sight only when it's handed directly to the investigators," he said. Hannah nodded. "No more secrets." The next morning, they drove to the state investigation office. Waiting inside were senior investigators, legal officials, and financial crime specialists. Daniel placed the evidence case on the table. "For 20 years, he began, this town believed Michael Walker disappeared without a trace." He looked around the room. "Today, we're here to show that the story was never that simple." 4 hours, investigators reviewed every piece of evidence. Michael's recordings, the original contracts, the altered signatures, bank records, photographs, witness statements, the journal, the forged ownership agreement. One investigator removed his glasses and looked at Daniel. "This is one of the most organized collections of evidence I've ever reviewed." Another investigator added, "If these documents are authentic, they reveal years of fraud and intimidation." Grace calmly replied, "They are authentic. I protected them for 20 years. Late that afternoon, a judge approved formal warrants to investigate Richard Walker and several business associates. By evening, news spread across Millbrook. People gathered outside shops, cafes, and farms, quietly talking. Many couldn't believe it. Others had waited decades for this day. Meanwhile, Richard Walker sat alone in his office. His phone rang constantly. Business partners, lawyers, old friends, one by one, they all gave him the same advice. Cooperate. Richard slammed the phone onto his desk. They have nothing. Just then, another call arrived. This time it was his attorney. The investigators searched your financial records. Richard's face changed. They found the offshore accounts. Silence. Then the attorney spoke again. "You should prepare yourself." Richard slowly lowered the phone. For the first time in his life, he realized money could not solve every problem. The following morning, investigators arrived at Richard's estate. Several officers entered the property with legal authorization. Boxes of documents were collected. Computers were examined. Financial records were secured. Neighbors watched quietly from across the road. No one celebrated. They simply watched history unfold. That afternoon, Hannah returned to her farm. She walked through the fields where she and Michael had once dreamed of building a family together. Although the years could never be returned, the truth had finally found its way home. Ethan joined her. "My father never stopped fighting." Hannah smiled gently. "No, he never did." She looked toward the horizon. "And now, we'll finish what he started." Just as they turned to walk back toward the farmhouse, Daniel's phone rang. He answered immediately. His expression changed. He looked at Hannah. The investigation found something unexpected. "What is it?" Hannah asked. Daniel took a deep breath. There was another witness. A witness no one knew was still alive. Hannah stared at him. "Who?" Daniel replied quietly. "A retired accountant. He handled Richard Walker's financial records. And he says he personally witnessed what happened to Michael Walker 20 years ago." The wind blew across the golden fields. Hannah closed her eyes. For years, she believed the truth was buried forever. But now, one final witness had stepped forward, and his testimony could answer the only question that still remained. What really happened to Michael Walker on the night he disappeared? The truth at last. The next morning, Hannah, Ethan, Grace, and Sheriff Daniel drove to a quiet town just outside Millbrook. They had come to meet the retired accountant. His name was Thomas Reed. For more than 25 years, Thomas had worked as the chief accountant for Richard Walker's company. After retiring, he disappeared from public life. Very few people even knew he was still alive. As they arrived at his small farmhouse, Thomas welcomed them inside. He looked nervous. His hands trembled as he poured coffee into old ceramic cups. Finally, he spoke. "I've carried this guilt for 20 years." Hannah looked at him quietly. "What happened to Michael?" Thomas lowered his head. He discovered everything. He found the fake contracts, the forged signatures, and the secret accounts. He wanted to expose Richard. Ethan clenched his fists. "So what did Richard do?" Thomas took a deep breath. He arranged a meeting with Michael at the old windmill. He promised they would settle everything peacefully. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "But it was a trap." Thomas nodded. When Michael refused to hand over the evidence, Richard threatened him. He told Michael that if he spoke to the authorities, Hannah would become the next target. The room became silent. Thomas continued. Michael made only one request. "Leave Hannah out of this." Richard agreed, but only if Michael disappeared forever. Hannah whispered, "So Michael left. To save me." Thomas nodded slowly. He sacrificed his own life and future because he believed it was the only way to protect you. Tears rolled down Hannah's face. For 20 years, she had wondered why Michael never returned. Now she finally understood. He had chosen love over his own happiness. Thomas stood up and walked toward an old cabinet. He removed a dusty folder. "I've kept one final document. Inside was the original financial ledger from Richard Walker's company. Every illegal payment had been recorded, every false land purchase, every hidden transaction. Most importantly, the ledger contained Richard Walker's personal signature approving them. Sheriff Daniel carefully examined every page. "This is the final piece." Later that afternoon, the evidence was officially submitted to the investigators. After reviewing the new ledger and Thomas's sworn testimony, the authorities completed their investigation. Richard Walker and several of his associates were formally charged for fraud, forgery, intimidation, and related financial crimes. The town watched quietly as years of deception finally came to an end. No one cheered. No one celebrated another person's downfall. Instead, people felt relief. The truth had finally replaced fear. Several months later, the farms that had been taken unfairly were reviewed through legal channels. Many families finally received long-awaited justice. Life slowly returned to Millbrook. One peaceful evening, Hannah stood beside Michael's memorial beneath a large oak tree overlooking the fields they once dreamed of farming together. She placed fresh white flowers at its base. "I waited 20 years to hear the truth," she whispered. "I wish you were here to see it." The wind gently moved through the tall wheat. For a moment, it felt as though Michael was standing beside her once again. Ethan walked over and smiled. "My father would be proud of you." Hannah smiled through her tears. "He never lost hope. And because of that, neither did I." Months later, the town held its annual harvest festival. This time, Hannah was invited as the guest of honor. The mayor addressed the crowd. For years, this community lived in fear. But one woman refused to let the truth stay buried. He turned toward Hannah. "You reminded us that courage is not about seeking revenge. It's about protecting what is right." The crowd stood and applauded. Hannah looked across the smiling faces of her neighbors. She finally felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Peace. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the golden fields, she took one last look at the farm she had fought so hard to protect. The secrets were gone. The lies were over. The truth had finally set everyone free. She smiled softly and whispered, "Sometimes the greatest victory isn't revenge. It's having the courage to protect the truth, no matter how long it takes." With the evening breeze carrying the scent of fresh harvest through the fields, Hannah walked home, not as a woman haunted by her past, but as a woman finally free to embrace her future. The end.